Hello again, and welcome to the next section of this week's presentation. We'll be talking about the importance of path dependencies and the importance of the legacies of previous regimes for processes of democratization. The basic point here is that it makes a big difference in the case of the former communist states, whether the last authoritarian regime was replaced in 1989, as was the case in most parts of the region, or later on, for example, in 2000, as was the case in states like Serbia and Croatia. And it also makes a difference whether the transition occurred through a combination of negotiation and elections, as was the case in most of the states in the former state socialist world, or through dramatic extra-legal action, as was the case probably most visibly in states like Romania. And the reason this matters, why does it matter that we have pacted transitions? It has to do with the ways in which approaches to the legacies of old regimes are structured, and in general, the greater the degree to which the transfer of power is the result of an agreement, the higher the level of constraint on the incoming governments in creating legal and practical breaks with the legacy of the previous regime. And this is in addition to structural barriers that always already exist, barriers like the makeup of the bureaucracy, the need to rely on existing repressive forces like the police and security services, the reliance of a large part of the population on existing systems of social spending. So the character of the previous regime, and in particular, the degree to which it enjoyed popular support or lacked it, and the degree to which it was perceived as legitimate or imposed, the degree to which it functioned legally or relied on repression, also determines to a degree how its former officials and supporters will be treated. It determines to what degree a new regime is going to make a rhetorical effort to establish distance between themselves and the old regime's legacy. And here we could talk about you know, post-socialist states that were taken over by strong neoliberal regimes like the Czech Republic and Poland as one extreme, possibly Serbia from 1989 to 2000, if this was a distinct regime, as another. Most likely all of the states in the region have some kind of hybrid mixture of those two types of new regime. One of the things that we can say is that understandings of the meaning and of the importance of communist rule have varied widely. There's a subsidiary question to this, which is the question of whether a country has a democratic tradition. I do not know whether this is a meaningful question, or whether, on the other hand, it's an elaborate way of expressing stereotypes. There are elements of probably every regime that could be described as democratic or not democratic. But let's go on to talk about the character of transition. We can talk about soft transitions, ones in which there's an attempt to move slowly and gently with a lot of transitional measures from an old system to a new one, and hard ones, ones that involve a kind of shock therapy, an attempt to move very quickly and dramatically from one system to another. Here's something that we can say, looking at the experience of post-socialist regimes empirically, that is that every transitional government has a similar trajectory. They come to power on a kind of wave of euphoria. Their coming to power is regarded as a popular victory. And in time, how much time? This varies, but typically it's about a year to 18 months. The cost of reforms and the effect of these reforms on employment and on the lives of people who depend on the state budget for support. Here we're talking particularly about older members of the population, pensioners, destroys their popularity. And so, in the first or second election after the transfer of power, there is some sort of populist reaction. This can come either from the nationalist right or from some recomposed version of the formerly ruling party. And this happens apparently without regard to how aggressively reforms are made. And this means, leaving aside the question of whether reforms are made in order to satisfy an international agenda such as EU conditionality, whether they're a good thing or not, let's assume for a moment that they are. The first transitional government has to do very little political calculation. No matter what they do, within 12 to 18 months, they're going to lose. The bad side of this is that it means that all post-communist revolutions, if we want to call them that, are at least a little bit poisoned. The good side of it may be that they quickly produce a legal and nonviolent transfer of power, which is often the test of legitimacy of any political regime. And it also means possibly that if we judge on the basis of comparative experience, the political benefits of a so-called soft transition, if there are any, are not expressed in terms of popularity, although they might be expressed in terms of some kind of long-term factors, such as institutional loyalty, or ways in which internal conflict develops within the state. What are some of the problems that are faced by all transitional regimes? This list is not exhaustive, but it certainly is a list of problems that all transitional regimes face. First, they are compelled to rely on a set of security structures, military, police, and other structures that are inherited from the previous regime, that are in some cases hostile to them and work against their interests, and whose loyalty is not certain. Second, the previous regime, particularly if it was very authoritarian, if it relied on a high level of internal surveillance, will have produced in the population a lot of accomplices, people who feel like they're being put at risk by processes of transition. They will be a source of resistance to many measures, in particular to transitional justice measures. Third, as we have already talked about a bit in talking about path dependencies, there will be constraints arising from the conditions under which power was transferred from one regime to another. Fourth, there will be within the population a relatively widespread fear of reprisal for what was done in the previous period. And then finally, since every regime will have some successes and some failures, every new regime runs the risk that failures of new democratic governments will be interpreted as failures of democracy itself. That is, that political opposition will turn into structural opposition. The result of this is that, at least in the short term, all transitions are bound to be challenged to a greater or lesser degree, and are bound to be incomplete to a greater or lesser degree.